Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. You might expect that the resting place of one of history's most powerful men, an emperor who once ruled more territory than anyone before or since, would be a place of grandeur. A mausoleum etched into cliffs, a valley carved with statues, or perhaps a domed temple that stands like a crown above the Mongolian grasslands. But if you ride for days across the vast steppes, tracing the winds that ripple through the reeds and listening to the silence that settles under the saddle, you won't find it. There is no shrine, no gravestone, no gate, no name carved in marble. There isn't even a trail. And yet, Genghis Khan is there, somewhere beneath the soil, gone, but never buried in the way most emperors are remembered. It is not just that his grave was hidden. It is that it was meant to disappear. The Mongols had a different idea of death than the sedentary civilizations they conquered. While other rulers marked their graves with great fanfare, pyramids and gold leaf inscriptions, the Mongols leaned into silence. They did not fear death, but they did not worship memory either, not in the way Western monuments or Chinese ancestor halls did. To the Mongols, life was motion, wind, horseback, cold rivers, and empty sky. What mattered was not what you left behind, but how far you had ridden. And so, when Temujin, known to us as Genghis Khan, died in 1227, his burial was planned to vanish the moment it was done. No tomb, no temple, not even a marker. And the men who buried him, they vanished to dot, not by mystery, but by deliberate command. This is what we know, and it is precious little. In the summer of 1227, Genghis Khan died during his campaign against the Western Shaya. The exact circumstances are still debated. Some say he fell off his horse, others that he died of illness or from wounds inflicted in battle. What is not disputed is that the Mongol army continued to conquer long after his death had been kept secret. His body, guarded by his most loyal warriors, was returned eastward. They traveled in silence, under the moonlight, bypassing known routes. The caravan is said to have crushed all footprints behind them, even rerouting streams to erase their passage. They were not hiding his death from enemies. They were hiding it from time. Once the caravan arrived in Mongolia, the details become even more obscure. Some say he was buried in the sacred Burkan Khaldan mountain, the place where, as a young fugitive, Temujin had once hidden during his rise to power. He had prayed there, offering thanks to the spirits of the mountain. In Mongol tradition, Burkan Khaldan became a holy site, one whispered about but rarely approached. No excavation has ever been permitted there, not because it is certain his tomb lies within, but because certainty itself is unwelcome. Mongolian law protects the mountain as sacred, not just physically, but symbolically. The idea that Genghis Khan might lie undisturbed somewhere within its folds is more powerful than a monument. Others tell of a darker tradition, that after Genghis Khan's burial, the soldiers who laid him to rest were executed so that they could never reveal the location, and those who executed them also killed. This chain of silence, so the story goes, continued until the last man, and the last man took his own life. You might think this sounds like legend, and perhaps it is, but Mongol history is often recorded by outsiders, Chinese chroniclers, Persian scribes, and later European historians. What the Mongols themselves wrote down was often poetic, metaphorical, or preserved through oral tales. In the secret history of the Mongols, the oldest surviving literary work in the Mongolian language, there is a silence, where the burial should be. The story skips over the details. It moves from death to succession without pause. It does not name the place. It does not name the act, because naming would have broken the ritual. Archaeologists have searched for centuries, from the Russian Tsars to modern satellite-equipped expeditions. People have scoured the lands north of the Kurlan River, the foothills of Kinti province, and the rugged passes near Burkhan-Khaldun. Dozens of false sites have been uncovered. Burial mounds, ancient tombs, ruins of seasonal camps, but nothing conclusively tied to the Great Khan. His DNA has never been found. No inscriptions, no artifacts bearing his personal mark. Even the location of his death, somewhere in Western Shah territory, has remained frustratingly ambiguous. In the 1990s and early 2000s, teams using drones and radar scanning claimed to have narrowed down possible zones, yet were blocked by national policy or public protest. You see, too many in Mongolia. The idea of digging for the tomb of Genghis Khan is not archaeology. It is desecration. The Great Khan's power did not come from wealth or ceremony. It came from belief in the unshakable wind of the steppe, in the sky, God, Tengri, in motion, discipline, in the absence of permanence. A grave with no name suits him better than any gold-topped shrine. In a strange way, Genghis Khan's vanishing tomb has become a kind of monument in itself, a void that resists closure, a whisper of historical humility in a world obsessed with proof. Every attempt to find him has only deepened the myth. Every expedition has returned with maps, soil samples, vague ruins, and a renewed sense of how little we actually know. And perhaps that is the point. Maybe the disappearance wasn't about secrecy. Maybe it was about return. A return to the land, to the ancestors, to the silence that predates language in Mongol tradition. To die is to become part of the earth again, not above it, not below it, but inside it, unclaimed by stone, unfollowed by footsteps, and this peculiar, poetic absence is the legacy he left behind. So why would the most powerful emperor of the medieval world choose to be forgotten? Or is that even the right word? Maybe he didn't want to be remembered. Maybe he wanted to become the memory itself, to sink into legend, not as a man, but as a presence in the wind, still galloping, still watching, still unnamed. Somewhere in the misty corners of medieval Asia, there rode a procession unlike any other in history, a caravan of shadow riders, whose only task was to ensure that their emperor's body would never be found. The Mongols, despite their nomadic simplicity, had one of the most efficient military and logistical systems in the world. They mapped rivers without ink, charted the wind with memory, and carried strategies in the minds of men rather than scrolls. And when their great leader died, they turned this same discipline to obscuring his final journey. Genghis Khan's burial procession was not a public display. It wasn't a parade. It was, in every sense, a disappearance, a carefully orchestrated vanishing. The details were known only to a handful of his most trusted generals, possibly Subutai, the military mastermind, and a few unnamed guards. Some of these men had grown up with Temujin, had seen him starve, fight, and bleed. They weren't just loyal. They were believers. The emperor's body, wrapped in tightly wound furs and sealed in secrecy, was likely placed in a humble wooden cart. No precious stones, no gilded coffin. The Mongols didn't believe in hoarding wealth in the grave. They believed in movement, simplicity, and leaving behind as little as possible. What followed was not a straight route home, but a winding, deceptive path through valleys, ravines, and dry riverbed areas that even skilled trackers would find difficult to navigate. Horses were changed often. Campsites were erased after every stop. Fires were doused with sand. Tracks were swept. At the heart of it all was a plan so extreme it bordered on mythical. Eliminate all witnesses, according to later Persian and Chinese accounts, and echoed in 20th century scholarship. Anyone who crossed paths with the funeral procession was immediately killed. Whether this was done through stealth or open confrontation remains unclear. Some versions claim that thousands of people, villagers, hunters, travelers, were slaughtered along the way. Others suggest that this story was a posthumous exaggeration to feed the myth of the Mongol emperor as a godlike being whose death, like his life, must remain untouched by common eyes. Still, the possibility remains that the Mongols believed absolute secrecy was part of the sacred rite, not out of fear, but out of reverence. In their cosmology, the soul was not supposed to be interrupted during its journey into the next life. Even a footprint over the wrong grave could disturb the cycle. Therefore, to protect the passage of the Khan's soul, silence was not only preferred, it was necessary, and so the guards, who rode silently through the night and scanned every horizon with trained suspicion, made sure that silence followed them like a cloak. There is another legend equally dark that says once the emperor had been buried, the men who interred him were themselves executed. Some claimed this was a willing act, that they saw it as an honor, a sacred sacrifice to preserve the sanctity of the site, and those who executed them, also sworn to secrecy, also fated to die. The logic, while brutal, follows a kind of nomadic clarity. The fewer the number of people who knew the location, the less chance of desecration. If no one survived the burial, then the secret would die with them. This pattern of burial through silence was not unique to Genghis Khan. Later, Mongol leaders, including his descendants like Gedai, Mengay, and even Kublai Khan, are said to have adopted similar burial customs. Their graves, too, have never been found. Across the steppes, scattered among the hills and passes, are rumors of stone mounds, sacred groves, and unnamed patches of land that locals avoid at night. But no tombs, no written names, only silence. Interestingly, much of what we think we know about this period comes from sources written long after the fact. The Yuan Shi, the history of the Yuan dynasty, compiled by Chinese historians after the fall of the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty, includes sparse and ambiguous references. Persian historians like Juvayni, who admired the Mongols for their military genius, also offered stylized descriptions. The Mongols themselves had no culture of monumental writing. Their oral histories, such as the Secret History of the Mongols, were poetic, metaphorical, and encoded with symbolism. Instead of dates and coordinates, you get lines like, "He went to the eternal blue sky." It is not that they lacked knowledge. It is that they saw permanence differently. They believed in breath, hoofbeats, and why not statues to a Mongol. The sky was both map and monument. Burkhan Khaldun, the mountain, believed by many to house the great Khan's tomb, sits quietly in eastern Mongolia, protected not by walls, but by reverence. It's not just a mountain. It's a spiritual axis, a place of pilgrimage. Genghis Khan, during his youth, had hidden there from enemies. Later, as ruler, he declared it sacred. Modern attempts to excavate Burkhan Khaldun have been met with resistance, not just from the government, but from the people, for many Mongolians. The idea of unearthing their founding ancestor is an act of profound disrespect. In the early 2000s, Japanese archaeologists were granted access to some surrounding areas. Their findings were inconclusive: stone formations, possibly man-made, possibly natural. But the core of the mountain remained untouched. The Mongolian government eventually passed laws prohibiting excavation within the sacred boundaries, not because they confirmed the tomb was there, but because the possibility was enough. In a way, the legend of the tomb had become more valuable than the tomb itself. You don't need to find Genghis Khan to feel his presence. You just need to ride under the sky he ruled in 2015. A team from the University of California attempted to use crowdsourcing and satellite imaging to scan vast regions of Mongolia for anomalies that might indicate burial sites. The data produced hundreds of candidates. Most were abandoned villages, natural mounds, or ancient structures unrelated to Mongol burial. And still, the tomb remained unfound to date. Over 600 burial mounds believed to be from the Mongol period have been discovered, but none confirmed to be the Khan's. Some historians believe this is intentional, that Genghis Khan was never meant to have a tomb that could be found, that the entire concept of burial was reimagined by the Mongols not as a way to preserve memory, but to release it in steppe culture. Remembrance is not tied to a grave. It is tied to stories, to songs sung round fires, to the rhythm of galloping horses, and to the winter wind howling across the plain. Even today, in Mongolia, elders might look at a cloudless sky and speak the name Temujin, not as a man, but as an element, a force, a silence that still moves. There is also a practical dimension to the mystery. The Mongols moved constantly. They had no cities in the traditional sense, only camps. They lived in gears yurts, which could be assembled and disassembled in hours. Their entire civilization was designed for speed, mobility, and impermanence. So why would they have left a permanent marker for the dead? That would have been inconsistent with every other part of their life philosophy. Death, to them, was not a disruption of the world. It was a return to it. Even the burial rites themselves reflected this idea. It is believed that Mongol dead, especially nobility, were buried deep, sometimes with sacrificed horses or attendants, sometimes not. The grave would be packed with earth and left unmarked. Some sources mention trees planted to hide the location, or the herding of cattle over the site to flatten the ground. There were no grand sarcophagi, no religious inscriptions, no visiting pilgrims, just earth, in silence, and the wind. And yet, even in their invisibility, these tombs have weight, historical gravity. Like black holes in the fabric of time, they draw curiosity inward. Why such secrecy? Was it protection? Was it fear? Or was it love? Was it that the Mongols, in all their brutality, still believed that the dead deserved peace? That memory could live longer if it had no name. That legacy could travel farther if it left no trail. And perhaps, just perhaps, the greatest way to honor a leader who lived in motion was to bury him in stillness, forever. By the time the 14th century arrived, the Mongol Empire had fragmented. What had once stretched from the Danube to the Pacific now splintered into smaller Khanates' golden horde. Chagatai, Khanate, Ilkhanate, and the Yuan dynasty in China. And, with the fading roar of Mongol conquests, came a peculiar quiet. No new tombs were ever unearthed. No grand monuments declared for the man who had united the steppes. In a world that carved stone for kings, Genghis Khan remained in absence. No mausoleum, no epitaph, no tomb. And yet, his influence never disappeared. Like the wind brushing across the high grasslands, continued, invisibly, untraceably. Let us now walk slowly, listener, through the quiet aftermath of a man whose final wish seemed to be erasure. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his children ruled over the greatest continuous land empire the world had ever known. But even they seemed to respect the code of silence around his burial. Son Gedai, who became Great Khan, never constructed a shrine or a temple. Nor did Kublai, who ruled as Emperor of China under the Yuan dynasty. This isn't to say the Mongols lacked reverence. Quite the opposite. They developed a unique system of ancestor worship, one that operated without graves or relics. Instead of visiting tombs, Mongol families held seasonal rituals known as Biddic ceremonies, performed in sacred spaces or upon mountains, where the spirits of ancestors were believed to reside not in the ground, but in the air. The dead were not entombed, they were carried in wind. European chroniclers were baffled. How could such a powerful figure leave behind nothing? No stone, no sarcophagus, no golden statue. By the time Marco Polo passed through Mongol territories in the 13th century, even he had little to say about the Khan's burial. The stories he picked up were vague. They spoke of vast valleys, of secrecy, and of death trailing the funeral party like a shadow. But there was no destination on his map. No arrow that said, "Here lies the emperor." To Europeans, this felt incomplete. But to Mongols, it felt complete in its own way. Later centuries brought new rulers with different customs. The Qing dynasty, who would eventually dominate Mongolia, brought with them a more Confucian style of honoring the dead, more temples, more ancestral halls. Russian explorers, arriving in waves across Siberia and Central Asia, cataloged ruins and burial sites of other cultures. Scythians, Turks, and ancient nomads whose names were long forgotten. But the Mongols, still no grave, still no name. And as archaeology developed into a formal science in the 19th century, curiosity turned into obsession. Western explorers scoured the Ordos region and the Anin River Valley. Soviet teams, decades later, turned to satellite imaging and deep trenching. Every new generation of researchers believed they might be the ones to break the mystery. But the mystery held dot in the 20th century. One site in particular began to capture attention: Ik Kenti, a wilderness reserve in northeastern Mongolia. According to the secret history of the Mongols, the oldest surviving literary work in Mongolian, this was where Genghis Khan was born and where he likely wished to be buried. Within this region stands Berk in Kaldin, a mountain that Genghis himself had declared sacred. He had once said, "Every morning I will worship Berk in Kaldin with offerings, and every day I shall honor it." This was not the language of conquest, but of return. And so, it's here that many believe his body lies. Somewhere deep in the folds of its valleys, hidden, undisturbed. The Mongolian government has strictly limited access to the mountain, both for cultural reasons and out of respect for its sacred designation. In a strange way, the government has helped preserve the Khan's invisibility, even in the satellite age. Mystery wins. Some researchers have turned to high-tech alternatives. In the early 2000s, Japanese teams used ground-penetrating radar. In 2015, the Valley of the Khans project, run by Albert Lin of the University of California, used satellite crowdsourcing to survey thousands of square kilometers. 8. They asked volunteers from around the world to scan satellite images for possible anomalies. They found hundreds of potential sites, but still, no tomb. Interestingly, when Albert Lin finally visited one of the most promising sites, he chose not to dig. Instead, he bowed. He let the grass remain untouched. As he later said, the greatest way to honor Genghis Khan might be to leave him in peace. Perhaps unintentionally, this gesture echoed the values of the people who buried him: to resist the temptation of discovery, to let silence endure. But what does it mean to vanish deliberately from the historical record? For Genghis Khan, it may have been a final act of control. He who had dictated the movements of empires could also dictate how he was remembered: to be untraceable, to exist as memory, not matter, to escape the very traps of immortality that so many other rulers fell into. The Egyptians built pyramids that crumbled. The Persians carved reliefs that eroded. The Chinese sealed emperors in tombs filled with mercury and clay. With the Mongols, they buried their dead in the earth and let the steppe reclaim them. No monuments, no eulogies, no names, only stories whispered around campfires. This cultural avoidance of tombs also shielded the Mongols from grave robbing and desecration. Unlike in Egypt or Mesopotamia, where tombs became magnets for looters and conquerors, the Mongol dead stayed untouched. There was no tomb to raid. there was no treasure to find. In fact, there are virtually no Mongol tombs of the imperial period that have yielded artifacts. The few that do exist are disputed or belong to minor nobles. No grand burial chamber has ever been excavated for Genghis Khan or his immediate descendants. Even Kublai Khan ruled an empire of splendor from the palaces of Dadu, modern-day Beijing, left behind no lavish mausoleum. Instead, his legacy survives in roads, scripts, trade networks, and ruined fortresses scattered across continents, not in stone, but in structure. And so, we come to the quietest truth of all. Sometimes, the most powerful legacies are the ones that leave no trace. There is a Mongolian proverb: a tiger dies and leaves its skin. A man dies and leaves his name. But what if the man was greater than a name? What if the man wished to be remembered, not as a body, but as a force, as something invisible and unending, like wind across the steppe? To remember Genghis Khan today is to remember 1,000 things at once: a warlord, a lawgiver, a shepherd, a destroyer, a father of nations. He was never one thing. Perhaps that's why his tomb remains hidden, because no single place could contain him. In the end, the silence is not emptiness. It is an answer in the form of a question, a reminder that not everything needs to be found, that some stories are meant to drift, to move with the clouds, to settle in the folds of grass, to be heard in the creak of a saddle and the hush of a distant hoofbeat. So when you next look at a map and see the vast blank spaces of Mongolian claimed, unmarked, untouched, remember that somewhere beneath the breath of the world lies the man who taught silence how to rule, how to rule. They were called the men who vanish, not because they disappeared, but because they made others vanish. You never met them. You never saw them. They had no names, no families, no past, and if you stumbled upon them by accident or fate too, would vanish. These were the soldiers chosen to guard the greatest funeral in Mongol history. A funeral that needed no flowers, no priest, and no one left to tell the story. This is not a tale of how Genghis Khan died. It is a tale of what happened next. The body of the most feared man in the world was carried across a continent, and everyone who saw it was quietly erased so that not even the dust would remember. In 1227, Genghis Khan died near the Liupan Mountains during his final campaign against the Western Shy. The exact cause is still disputed. Some say he fell off his horse. Others whisper he was wounded in battle. But no one argues this. His death was sudden, secret. No proclamation was issued. No funeral march announced. Even his own soldiers didn't know at first. The Khan's body was placed in a sealed cart, and only his closest attendants were told. A small detachment of elite guards, bound by an oath older than their birth, was summoned to escort him home to Mongolia. These men were known by no formal title, but their task had been planned for decades. They would carry the body and kill anyone who saw them. The journey back home took weeks. Imagine the route across enemy territory, past rivers and deserts, through high passes dusted with snow. The funeral procession traveled only by night. They covered their tracks. They burned their camps at dawn, and whenever they were spotted by shepherds, farmers, or travelers, they did not warn or plead. They erased, not to be cruel, but because their mission was bigger than kindness. The Khan's final command had been clear: no one must know where I lie. And so they obeyed as they neared the sacred mountains of Berken-Chalden. The terrain grew wilder. Forests thickened. Paths narrowed into deer trails. The air grew thin and cold here. Somewhere in this silence, they would bury him and vanish. But not before one final purge. For when the men arrived at the burial site, likely a secluded valley northeast of the Annan River, they carried out one last duty. They killed the laborers who dug the grave. These were volunteers or slaves. Perhaps even trusted craftsmen, brought for this sacred task. But they had seen too much. They had touched the earth where the Khan would sleep, so they were silenced. Next came the guards themselves. No record survives of what happened to them, but legends say they were escorted away and executed to preserve the secret. Others say they rode into the steppe, scattered in all directions, forbidden to ever speak again. Some became monks, some simply walked into history and disappeared. The location of the grave was now known only to the land. It may seem cruel, even horrifying, but to the Mongols, it was sacred. A secret grave wasn't just a sign of humility, it was protection. The spiritual world was fragile, easily disturbed by tomb raiders, by enemies who might desecrate the bones, or by foreign kings hoping to make a trophy of the dead. The Mongols did not want their Khan on display. They wanted him to return to the earth, quietly, invisible, to ride again with the ancestors, not to lie under stone, but under sky. There is a name for this kind of burial. It's called a sky burial. Though Genghis Khan's own may have followed a stricter earth burial rite, the idea was the same, to return the body to the natural world without memorial, without interference. This tradition survives in parts of Mongolia and Tibet even today. The body is given not to a grave, but to the elements, left on a hillside, eaten by vultures, dissolved by time, a final act of surrender. Nothing is marked, nothing is saved, because the soul has already moved on. This isn't to say that Genghis Khan was forgotten. In fact, he became more myth than man in the centuries that followed, but his grave, it remained the only quiet part of his legend. Even as Europe built cathedrals for kings, and China built tombs the size of cities, the Mongols kept their silence. For generations, Mongol families told their children that speaking of the Khan's tomb was forbidden, not because of shame, but because of reverence. The land itself would protect him. The land would hide him, and that silence became part of the inheritance. Archaeologists still debate the specifics of this funeral operation. How many guards were there? A dozen? 50? Where did they bury the attendants? How did the logistics work in an age before maps, drones, or GPS? We may never know, but one clue may lie in the structure of Mongol military discipline. The guards who performed this mission were likely drawn from a special unit within the Kasikta Imperial Guard Corps. These men lived with the Khan, traveled with him, and died for him. They were not just bodyguards, they were shadows, and they trained for secrecy from childhood. This wasn't improvisation. It was part of the plan. The secrecy extended into the bureaucratic record as well. When Genghis Khan succeeded his father, there was no tomb to visit, no relic to display. Even in state rituals, the burial was not mentioned directly. Instead, the court turned its focus to legacy laws, taxes, alliances. The man was gone, but his absence had become presence. Centuries later, during the Soviet occupation of Mongolia, in the 20th century, the sacred mountain of Berchtesgaden was placed under military restriction, not for security, but for silence. Soviet authorities feared that a rediscovered tomb could spark nationalist fervor, that it could become a symbol too powerful to control, and so the silence continued. Even in modern Mongolia, debates persist. Should the grave be found? Should it be opened? Or is the mystery itself the monument? Can you honor a man by never uncovering him? Perhaps the deepest irony is this: the men who killed to hide the grave are the only reason we remember it at all. Their legend has preserved the mystery for 800 years, and while their names are lost, their duty survives in whispers. They were not monks, not scribes, not builders of tombs. They were racers, not of memory, but of location, and what they erased may be the greatest historical act of reverence the world has ever seen. And so we are left with a riddle. A man who conquered half the world lies somewhere beneath a forest or hill, not marked, not mourned, not found, only followed by stories, by questions, by footsteps that will never reach the end. The Khan is gone, but the secret still rides. The steppe does not speak. It never has. And yet, hey, in the faint whistle of wind over the grasses of eastern Mongolia, there remains a kind of whisper, hush, more ancient in memory, where the silence says more than 1,000 chronicles. It says, do not follow. After all, you are tracing the death of a man who erased his own ending in Section 1. We traveled alongside the invisible procession, those elite warriors who carried the lifeless body of Genghis Khan back through secret terrain, killing as they went, so that no eyes will survive to remember the way. But how, you might ask, do you protect a secret from even the future? This section explores what came next, how the Mongols not only buried their great Khan with no name, but erased his final resting place from both history and geography, but turning it into a ghost that even satellites cannot catch. You may wonder how such a powerful figure left no visible grave, but the truth lies in something deceptively dull: logistics. To understand the burial of Genghis Khan, you have to understand how Mongol systems worked, not just swords and raids, but supplies, schedules, and silence. This wasn't just about death, it was about administration. The Mongol Empire, at its peak, stretched from Korea to Hungary, from the icy forests of Siberia to the warm rivers of Baghdad. But unlike Rome or China, the Mongols didn't build permanent cities of stone. They ruled from tents, moving across the steppe with herds and maps that lived in the minds of men. Their greatest treasure was not architecture, it was mobility. And that mobility shaped how they handled death, even the death of a Khan. The return of Genghis Khan's body from China to Mongolia required military precision. Every stream crossed had to leave no trace. Every hoofprint had to vanish behind the last man's shadow, according to several scattered records. The funeral guard used covered carts and split travel routes, doubling back in zigzags to confuse any distant observer. But more than clever movement, they had a hidden asset: the terrain itself. Eastern Mongolia is a place of broad, endless landscape valleys that fold into each other like old parchment. Hills that seem identical, grasses that shift with every season. If you buried a man there, even with a modest cairn of stones, the earth would reclaim it in weeks. 1,000 years later, it would be as if he never existed. One ancient text claims that a river was diverted, temporarily rerouted, to bury the body beneath its flow. If true, this would be one of the most remarkable engineering acts of historical burial. Imagine the labor: diverting water, taking channels, releasing it all back, and then letting nature take over. The river would resume its flow. The earth would close its lips. The secret would drown in ordinary time. No gravestone, no monument. Just silence, carried by current. Whether the tale is true or not, the Mongol mind valued such methods. You didn't need stone pyramids. You needed water, grass, mud, sky. Let the earth bury its own emperor. Some argue the body was placed inside a massive stone coffin beneath the ground. Others think he was cremated. But these questions may never find answers. The Mongols were nomads. To them, permanence was not in stone, but in tradition. The living remembered through story, not sarcophagus. And the grave was not a place to visit, it was a place to forget. It's precisely because memory was held elsewhere, in rituals, in laws. In the whisper of clan elders, to visit a grave was to suggest a king could be bound by location. In Genghis Khan, he was bound only to the steppe. In the 13th century, the court of his grandson, Kublai Khan, would begin to lean toward Chinese customs, more bureaucratic, more permanent. But the generation immediately after Genghis clung tightly to the ways of the horse. The tent, the silent burial. The Yuan dynasty left no official tomb inscription for Genghis, and in Mongol language. His death is sometimes referred to not as he died, but as he went to rest. The location was not the point. The return to nature was. One curious group of stories surrounds a place called Ik Korik, or the Great Taboo. Located in the Kinti Mountains, this restricted area, about 240 square kilometers, was sealed off by successive governments for hundreds of years. Entry was forbidden to all but the royal family and their trusted monks. No roads, no settlements, just thick forest and rumor. Many believe this is where Genghis Khan was buried, not because of evidence, but because of absence. The absence of travelers, the absence of roads, the absence of sound in a world constantly excavated, mapped, and measured. This area remains curiously untouched. Why? Why did even modern governments, Soviet and Mongolian alike, protect this one patch of land from mining, tourism, or development? Because perhaps the land itself is still keeping a secret. By the 20th century, the world began to change. Satellites mapped the planet. LiDAR scanned through trees. Drones traced ridges. And yet, nothing, no grave, no bones, no monument. Thousands of archaeological missions have been proposed. Dozens attempted. Some claimed to find clues. Others only found ordinary soil. A team led by American archaeologists used satellite imagery in 2003 to identify unusual earth patterns in northeastern Mongolia. The data seemed promising, perhaps a hidden structure, but it turned out to be a natural formation, or so we're told. The truth is, we may never know whether the grave was found and quietly reburied, or whether the earth simply remains better at hiding than we are at searching. You may wonder why the modern world hasn't insisted harder. After all, wouldn't finding the tomb be a monumental discovery? A chance to uncover artifacts, DNA, perhaps a final glimpse into the life of the man who shaped continents. But here's the strange part. Most Mongolians don't want it found. Not because they don't care, but because they still do. Too many. Finding the tomb would not be a victory. It would be a violation. It would break the ancient pact, the pact that says, let him sleep, do not follow. One modern Mongolian historian, Badr Erdene, once wrote, the grave of the Khan is not for tourists. It is not a place. It is a story. And the story has already been told. And so, the silence continues, not out of fear, but out of duty, in a quiet valley, perhaps even today. A deer walks over moss-covered earth. Beneath it, 6 feet deep or perhaps deeper, there may lie a shroud of bones wrapped in felt, resting near a rusted sword and the fragments of a torn silk banner. Or there may be nothing. Perhaps the Khan was burned or left to the sky. But in either case, deer does not know, and neither do we. What we do know is this: the guards returned from their task with no words. Some never returned at all. Their mission died with them. Their families did not speak. The empire passed into other hands, and the mountain kept its peace. Genghis Khan did not need a monument. He had history, and the silence became part of that history. So what does it mean when an empire ends in dust, but its memory survives? What does it mean when a grave has no name, but more legend than all the tombs of kings? Perhaps it means that some stories are too big for stone. Perhaps the greatest mark of power is not to be remembered, but to be sought. Leslie, across centuries, the question remains, if we found the grave tomorrow, dug it up, carbon dated it, and placed its relics in a museum, would that truly solve anything? Would it only break the spell so the second section ends, not with a discovery, but with a trail that still disappears behind us? The steppe remains unchanged. The silence continues, and somewhere the secret sleeps. You are standing in the wind now, A vast plain stretches before you, dry with summer dust, broken only by the occasional large tree or granite stone that time has softened. The Kinti Mountains roll low in the distance, their slopes shrouded in the quiet fog of centuries. Here, we arrive at the final part of a story that was never supposed to be told. The story of the last man who knew where Genghis Khan was buried. But even knew may be too generous a word, because knowing, in this case, meant carrying the memory only as long as your breath lasted, and then letting it vanish with your final exhale. Let's return to the funeral procession, not the first leg, where the body was carried, but the return leg, the moment the secret had already been buried. Now, all those who had seen it had to disappear. A tale preserved in both Persian chronicles and Mongolian. Oral traditions says that the honor guard, perhaps several dozen, perhaps hundreds, killed every bystander they encountered along the way, showing that no villager, shepherd, or merchant could report their direction. But then, the honor guard themselves vanished. Did they return? Some say no. One version claims the remaining soldiers were killed by a second team of assassins warriors, whose sole job was to eliminate the burial crew once their task was done. It's a third circle of silence. One more ring to erase the previous one. But even this might not be enough, because even assassins know things. And so the circle closes tighter. The men who killed the gravediggers were, in some versions, executed as well by another layer of secrecy, more remote, more loyal, more silent. At some point, the snake eats its own tail until there is no one left to speak. This process may sound like myth, too extreme to be true, but it fits a broader pattern found across many Mongol institutions, layers upon layers of hierarchy and loyalty, strict oaths, and brutal enforcement of silence. In the Yam system, the Mongol, the empire's famed relay post network, messages were carried swiftly across thousands of kilometers. But if a courier revealed a secret, even accidentally, their entire family could be punished. Silence was not just policy, it was law, and it extended even to death. So, who were these guards? What kind of men were chosen to escort the body of the Khan to its final resting place? They were not ordinary soldiers. They were the Keshig, the imperial bodyguards of the Mongol court, sworn to protect the life of the Khan while he lived, and to guard his spirit when he died. The Keshig were handpicked from elite clans, men of discipline, men of no personal ambition, men whose greatest pride was obedience. Serving in the Keshig was not only an honor, it was a destiny. Even death in their line of duty was considered noble, especially if it served the Khan's eternal peace. Some records suggest that members of this honor guard volunteered for the final funeral escort. Knowing they would not return, they rode in silence. Final mission. Their reward was not coin or land, it was disappearance, oblivion in service of a greater cause. And, to the Mongol mind, that was sacred to be forgotten for the sake of the Khan, was a kind of immortality. Centuries later, European and Russian explorers came across burial practices among certain Mongol tribes that mirrored this silence. No headstones, no markings, only shallow depressions in the earth, often disguised with turf and brush. When asked why they buried their dead in such an anonymous way, some elders responded simply, because the sky knows. That was enough. The eternal blue sky Tengri watched all. And what more did you need than to rest beneath its gaze? A grave marker could be defiled, a name could be mispronounced, but the sky was Incorruptible. It did not forget, and so it was trusted to remember what humans could not. Modern researchers have tried to piece together fragments in the early 1990s. A joint Mongolian-Japanese team launched a quiet investigation using ground-penetrating radar. They mapped out promising terrain in the Kinti region, looking for anomalies, straight lines, rectangular shapes. Anything artificial, they found dozens. But every time a team returned for physical inspection, they were blocked, not by superstition, but by the Mongolian government. Despite changes in leadership, despite growing tourism, there remains a quiet, spoken agreement. Let the grave stay buried. Let the silence remain whole. One Mongolian archaeologist, who asked to remain anonymous in an interview, put it this way: if we dig and find nothing, the world will be disappointed. If we dig and find something, we will be cursed for breaking the last silence. So we do not dig. That dilemma defines the paradox of power. The greatest conqueror in world history, a man whose armies changed maps, economies, and languages, lies in a grave that might never be found. And perhaps that is the only fitting ending. Let's step back for a moment. In modern culture, we are used to tombs that proclaim, "Look at me." It's pyramids of Giza, the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huang, the Taj Mahal, stone, carved to command remembrance. But the Mongols chose the opposite. Their tombs whispered, "Forget me. I have returned to the land." And maybe this was not just a cultural value. Maybe it was strategy. Genghis Khan understood that to build an empire that could outlive him, he needed to leave no focal point for civil war, no relic for cult worship, no burial for enemies to desecrate by disappearing. He left nothing to fight over, only a name, only a myth. In 2020, satellite technology had advanced enough to allow citizen researchers to contribute. One project, funded in part by National Geographic, invited thousands of volunteers to comb through satellite images for unusual terrain features. Some were hopeful. One group even identified a rectangular platform, 400 meters above sea level, shaded by pine trees and untouched by development. But when a research team went to verify it, they found only rock and brush, nothing underneath, just earth, just time, just quiet. And so the search continues. Every few years, a new theory surfaces. Was the body burned? Was it buried beneath a river? Is it under the Erdene Zul monastery? Or beneath the foundations of a secret palace, now long gone? But each theory falls apart upon scrutiny. The silence holds. The earth does not speak. The last men who knew are long gone. Their bones, dust, their oaths still intact. And perhaps, somewhere in the folds of a grass-covered ridge, there lies a patch of ground that feels just slightly different. Softer, maybe. Quieter. Maybe you've even walked over it. Maybe thousands have. But they didn't notice, because that was the point. The grave was never meant to be seen. It was meant to be forgotten, so that the story could survive without the proof. So that the idea of Genghis Khan, the fear, the power, the silence, could remain unbroken. Let us pause here, in the wind, reflect. What does it mean for the greatest ruler in world history to disappear? Does it diminish him? Or does it elevate him? Is the absence of a tomb a loss for historians? Or the final, perfect act of control? He ruled life, and then he ruled death. So the story ends, not with discovery, but with dust. Not with answers, but with peace. A grave with no name. A trail with no markers. A silence that still holds. And perhaps that's the final legacy of the Khan. Not what he built, but what he erased. He erased. You wake to the hush of wind across the steppe. The early light breaks through a pale mist that clings to the grasslands like memory soft, lingering, quiet. There are no trees here, no stone markers, just an ocean of swaying green. But buried, deep beneath this unmarked plain, is something else entirely. Bones, thousands of them, and above them, walking alone in dawn's chill, is a woman with calloused hands, bowed shoulders, and eyes that do not rise to meet the horizon. Her name has not survived. Her family name may have faded with the dust of the yurts her people once lived in. But her task, her devotion, her ritual has become legend in the quietest corners of Mongol oral history. She was the caretaker of a field with no names, and no one but her was meant to know it existed. To understand her, you must understand the strange paradox of death in the Mongol world. Public grief was rare, funerals were private, and remembrance was silent. This was not due to indifference, but reverence. The dead were not to be disturbed. Their rest was not to be interrupted by stone, song, or ceremony. Instead, the dead were folded back into the land, their bodies hidden so completely that even their spirits could not be found again. This silence had a practical side. Graves could not be desecrated if they could not be located. Enemies could not boast of conquests if no memorials were left behind. But the emotional cost of this silence is that lingered, and some felt it. Some carried it in their bones, like the woman whose footsteps traced invisible lines across the soil. She is believed to have lived in the 14th century, long after the great Khans had passed, during the era when the Mongol Empire had splintered into smaller khanates. This was a time of fading, unity, of quiet civil wars and diplomatic tension. Mongol princes fought over scraps of legacy, while the old rituals clung to life in the hands of those no longer at the center of power. The field where she walked, its location still debated, was not a royal necropolis. It was not a battlefield or a temple. It was something quieter. It was a burial zone for the fallen of the Kashik, the old imperial guard. Not the Khans themselves, but the men who protected them, fought beside them, died in their service. Men whose names, even then, were mostly lost. There are no official records of this field, but references to it appear in fragments scribbled in the margins of a Persian traveler's diary, spurred in a 17th century manuscript recovered from a Buddhist monastery, hinted at in the oral chants of Mongol shamans who passed through the region with offerings of milk and incense. And in each version there is a mention of a woman. She lived alone, no yurt, just a low earthen dwelling dug partially into the slope of a hill. She had no livestock, no children, and no community. Once a week, it is said, she would walk the field, her eyes always on the ground, never the sky. She did not sing, she did not weep, but with each step, she would pause, whisper something inaudible, and then continue. No one knows how she came to this role. Perhaps she was a widow of one of the dead. Perhaps she was a daughter of the Kashik, raised among warriors, but spared the sword. Or perhaps more likely she was chosen, appointed by one who still held on to the old customs, a silent priestess of a wordless religion. The burial customs of the Kashik were modeled after those of the Khans. No stones, no inscriptions. The dead were laid with their faces to the sky, their weapons beside them, their names removed from all record. But unlike the Khans, they were not protected by legends or mystery. They were not subjects of myth. Their silence was complete, except for her. She remembered. She walked. Some sources say she maintained a secret map. She not on parchment, but memorized. It's passed orally to a single successor before death. Others believe she had no map, only memory, that she could walk to any point in that field and point to the bones below with exact precision. Her work was not ceremonial. She tended no flowers. She laid no wreaths, but she made small repairs to the land, refilled holes left by burrowing animals, smoothed the depressions after rains, brushed away the droppings of birds. She was the last defense against forgetfulness. And yet, she never spoke of them, never told stories. She did not preserve history the way scribes or poets might. She preserved silence. She embodied it. There is a strange kind of grief, in this one that does not seek an audience, the grief that does not ask for comfort, a grief that becomes practice. You may have known it in your own life. A loved one lost, and no one to share the memory with, so you carry it, and it becomes a rhythm at some point. No one is sure when she died. Her body was not found, but the field remained quiet, and for many years after, Mongol travelers reported that livestock would not graze there. Horses would not sleep there. Children did not play there. Something about the earth felt closed, as if it had folded in on itself, as if it was keeping a secret. Later, Buddhist monks passed through, and though they did not disturb the field, one carved a line in a distant tree trunk. This is a place where silence lives. We shall not enter. The tree no longer stands, but someone wrote the phrase down, and it passed quietly from mouth to mouth, till it, too, faded. Why was there never a monument? Why no effort to preserve the woman's name? It's possible no one thought it necessary to preserve her would be to explain her, and she was not meant to be explained. She was meant to vanish, like the men she tended. Her story is not about her. It's about the shape of what she protected. Not a shrine, but an absence. And so, you must ask, what kind of civilization chooses to bury its defenders in total anonymity? What does it say about their understanding of power, of memory, of permanence? Most cultures remembered through stone. The Mongols remembered through wind. As we close this section, consider what is preserved when we deliberately forget. Can silence itself become a form of remembrance? And if so, what does it ask of us now? Do we speak of her? Do we write her name? Or do we follow her path in silence, letting the grass grow tall above forgotten men, letting the earth keep what it has taken, letting memory exist without a monument? By now, you might be wondering, if no stone ever marked a grave, if no ink ever recorded her name, then how did any of this survive? Why does even the faintest whisper of her story remain? It is not through documents, not in the conventional sense. There was no parchment sealed in beeswax, no monk chronicling her in the margins of a sacred text, no Western traveler cataloging the mystery as he made his way from Samarkand to Karakorum. What we have, what we think we have, comes from fragments, soft traces, and obscure oral traditions. Repetitions of a name that may have only ever been a title passed from one keeper to the next. One such mention came from an aging Mongol herder, interviewed in the early 20th century by a Russian ethnography. Searching for shamanic echoes in post-imperial folklore, the herder spoke of a bone walker, a woman who never spoke above a whisper and knew where not to place her feet. She would refuse to sit on certain patches of grass, even if they were the only dry spots for kilometers. When asked why, she would say simply, because that place remembers. It's unclear whether this story was meant to describe the same woman from the field, the Keshik, but it matches. And in stories like these, matches are all we have. During the high period of the Mongol Empire, from Genghis Khan's rise in the early 13th century through the fragmentation after Kublai Khan, the logistics of war required more than just military strength. It demanded infrastructure, supply lines, courier networks, codes of conduct, and most invisibly, a way to process death. The Keshik, the elite guard of the Khans, were buried quickly, efficiently, and with minimal footprint, not to preserve life, but to deny it the permanence of memory. The Mongol view of permanence differed from ours. They believed not in eternal monuments, but in returning warriors to the cycle of the land. A warrior who died well should disappear into the earth without a ripple, and so grave marking was forbidden. Even the act of mourning publicly was considered dangerous. It drew attention to the location of burial, risking desecration by enemies or looters. And so the role of the bone walker, whether that name is literal or symbolic, was not to enshrine or memorialize. It was to erase gently, with care, to let death be absorbed. But in time, the field did draw attention, not because anyone wanted to find it, but because of how persistently it refused to be found. You see, The Mongol Empire eventually shrank, fragmented, and collapsed into smaller khanates. Many burial sites were lost to time. Others were built over by later generations who saw no significance in an empty steppe. But this field, this particular one, was passed over again and again. Entire settlements bypassed it. Trade. Caravans went around it. Nomadic herders avoided, pitching their gears there. A kind of cultural avoidance, not from fear, exactly, but from an inherited caution. They couldn't say why, but they knew not to disturb it. One traveler, a Sogdian merchant, whose journal was translated only in the late 1800s, wrote of a stretch of grass that made the horses uneasy. No bird landed, and no shadow fell. Whether it was superstition or instinct, no one could say. But over time, those voids become maps in themselves. And yet, there was someone who knew how to read that map, not by sight, not by words, but by rhythm, by the tilt of the land, the shift of the grass, the memory of a lopsided hoofprint a decade gone. It was said she walked the field in the same order each time, not with ceremony, but with repetition, like sweeping a floor or folding laundry, the caretaking of death. And like many women in history who performed invisible labor, she was not written into scrolls or chronicled by bards. Acts weren't heroic in a conventional sense. She didn't heal, didn't fight, didn't teach. She simply preserved absence. One of the few mentions of her appears in a Buddhist text about karmic cycles. It tells of a woman who once tended a graveyard so faithfully that she became a mirror, reflecting no light, casting no shadow, but absorbing every footstep in silence. Again, we can't prove this, refer to her, but silence has fingerprints. If you know where to look, there's one more thread, a rather unexpected one. In the 19th century, a British officer stationed in northern India came across an old Mongol map, drawn not on paper, but on silk, fragile and brittle with age. The map was strange. It showed no cities, no roads, only undulating lines and an irregular scattering of dots. He assumed it was a weather map, but later, a Mongolian scholar identified it as a funerary grid, a secret burial layout, possibly belonging to the Keshik. But when asked how anyone could have kept track of so many invisible graves, the scholar smiled and said, "Someone always remembers, even if they are forbidden to speak." That quote has stayed with historians ever since, which brings us back to the woman. Why did she do it? I maintain a field no one would ever see. There are theories. Some say she was the last surviving member of a forgotten clan tasked with spiritual duties in the days before Buddhism overtook older Mongol beliefs. Others suggest she was not just one woman, but part of a lineage of bone walkers women who passed their duty to their daughters in hushed tones before death. Another possibility is this, that she was once a servant or daughter of the Keshik, spared in battle, and this was her penance or perhaps her devotion. Whatever the truth, her work was never meant to last forever. It was designed to last long enough for memory to fold quietly into myth, then dust, then wind. Today, archaeologists debate whether they've located the original burial field. Some believe it lies beneath a vast plain in Kevsgal province. Now, covered in wildflowers, ground-penetrating radar has revealed irregular soil disturbances, but no bones, no weapons, no artifacts, nothing the world would accept as proof. And perhaps that's how she intended it. Perhaps the final stage of her work was to allow even her own footsteps to vanish, like snow melting into the steppe. So then, what remains? You listening now, know of her? You can see her in your mind, thread, bare, robe, hands gnarled with time, eyes scanning the dirt for stories no one else is allowed to read. She may not have wanted this, but the echo has found you, and you must now decide, is remembering her a betrayal of her silence, or a tribute to the task she carried alone. As you drift into sleep, one thought lingers: if no stone remembers you, and no name survives, but one pair of footsteps walks the ground above you for years, is that not a kind of immortality? One that hums below the surface, soft, invisible, but eternal, eternal. You return to the plane now not as a visitor, not even as a scholar, but as a quiet witness. The wind hasn't changed. It still carries that hollow hush. The air is thin, dry, wide open. You feel it on your skin, that peculiar stillness of a place that was once busy with the business of death and has since surrendered to grass. No monuments greet you, no dates carved in stone, no names to place or erase, just a field, an ordinary field, and yet it is heavy with something you can't name. Maybe that's the truest part of it all. The woman who walked these grounds didn't do so to remember people in the way we crave names, faces, legacies. She did it to honor the shape of a loss that was not supposed to be voiced, to carry the weight of forgetting, gently, to tread where no one else would, to preserve the discipline of reverence through pure, anonymous practice. But what happened when she died? This is where the silence becomes even more profound, because unlike the names of the warriors she guarded, his anonymity was by design. Hers was ambiguous. She wasn't meant to be recorded, and yet she wasn't fully forgotten either. Role lingered, even if she didn't. That tells us something in Mongol cosmology. There was a distinction between two kinds of death. The first was Bodhin, quiet, death of fading into the fabric of the world, as natural as the setting sun. The second was Zaya, a death that carried intent, consequence, cant, and legacy, often reserved for lords, priests, and conquerors. She lived a life of Bodhin, and perhaps she was content with that. But history, that stubborn, unfinished map, gives her a Zaya, whether she wanted one or not, in the generations after her disappearance. Stories filtered through the shamanic networks of the north. Nomadic priests who traced ancient migration trails told of a steppe guardian who walked only in spirals and spoke to no one but the soil. In some traditions, she became a spirit herself, not a ghost to fear, but a presence to be respected. A reminder that reverence doesn't require fanfare, that silence can be sacred. 2. There's an old Mongolian proverb: the loudest memory is a forgotten one. At first glance, it's a contradiction. How can something forgotten make any sound at all? But this is not a world of logic. It's a world of feeling, of slow gestures, of devotion without reward. And in that world, the woman's footsteps echo, even if her name does not done. So what became of the burial field? Eventually, a few curious archaeologists did attempt excavations in suspected regions, not to desecrate tonally, to understand. But every time they tried, the equipment failed. Not dramatically, just subtly. Batteries drained, drones malfunctioned, ground-penetrating radar returned with static. Some blamed environmental factors. Others quietly said the land did not want to be touched. One researcher, a half-Mongol geophysicist, reportedly wept during an expedition, not out of frustration, but reverence. She described standing alone on the plain, her boots sinking slightly into the thawed earth, and feeling the distinct sensation that she was being watched not by a hostile force, but by 1,000 eyes, too polite to interrupt her. Later that night, she wrote, "I understand now why she never mapped it. It is not meant to be mapped. It is meant to be walked." Somewhere around that same time, a new custom emerged among a few nomadic herders in the region on the first night of spring. As the frost finally lifts, they walk in silence across whatever plains their ancestors used to roam. They carry nothing, say nothing, leave no markers. The elders claim this is a way to remind the wind of its promises, It is possible this tradition has no link to the burial field or the bone walker at all. But if you ask them privately, some will admit that the silence has a shape, that they are not walking nowhere, that they are honoring something beneath. Not someone specific, but someone real. To walk without a nap is an act of faith. To remember without names is an act of discipline. To return to the same invisible places over and over, long after the memory has gone soft and the stories have blurred into ritual that is something else entirely, something close to worship. And so we return to the woman. Was she real? A specific figure who lived in the 1300s and carried out duties entrusted to her by a dying empire? Or was she a composite, spiritual symbol created by generations of people who needed to believe that someone had not forgotten? Both answers may be true, because history, in its most honest form, is not about certainty. It's about the space between known and unknown, about how we carry memory even when the details dissolve. You might be asking now, why does this matter? Why does the story of a nameless woman walking over a field of forgotten bones deserve attention? What use is there in honoring someone whose job was to keep others from being honored? But consider this. We often measure history by what was built: cities, fortresses, statues, roads. But there is also value in what was protected by being left alone. There is a kind of courage in the unseen, in the unrewarded, in the daily, repetitive act of reverence. She may have never picked up a sword, but she preserved peace, not just between the living and the dead, but between memory and silence. In the modern world, we are obsessed with visibility, with making our mark, with legacy, but her story suggests another path, that perhaps the most powerful form of remembrance is the one that asks for nothing in return, that honors without claiming, that mourns without performing, that remembers without needing to be remembered. As the sun sets again over the endless steppe, you begin to understand something. The field she walked no longer needs a map, because she didn't walk to find. She walked to preserve absence, to let nothingness be what it was. Not a failure to remember, but a deliberate choice to let the land keep its secret. And so, we close this story not with resolution, but with rhythm, with the imagined sound of footsteps brushing against grass, one slow step at a time, over a field that holds no names, stones, no trail, only silence and care and care. You are in the middle of the Eurasian steppe. No trees, no mountains, just a horizon so vast and flat that the sky itself feels heavier than the land. The only sound is the soft exhale of the wind moving through brittle grass, and maybe just faintly the hooves of a lone horse pacing somewhere far ahead. This is where the Mongol Empire once moved its secrets, not in gilded palaces, not in carved scrolls or jeweled safes, but on horseback, tied beneath tunics, slipped inside boots, or hidden in the folds of a saddle blanket. And among all the couriers who served this system, one name remains, not because it was glorified, but because it nearly disappeared. His name was Oki Balad, a quiet man, a fast rider, and, for a short period of time in the 13th century, the most burdened person in the entire empire. You might imagine a courier as a mere messenger, a man with a horse and a scroll, riding from one outpost to another. But in the Mongol world, couriers were lifelines arteries through which policy, death orders, military intelligence, and tribute instructions flowed. The Mongols had created a sophisticated relay system called the Yam. Think of it as a cross-continental network of relay stations, okay? Every 25 to 30 miles, a fresh horse, okay? Every 50 to 70 miles, a rest point with food, shelter, and guards. It allowed information to travel from China to Eastern Europe in mere weeks of feet. No other power could match at the time. Oki Balad was trained in this system from the age of 11. Born into a minor clan with no famous warriors and no aristocratic lineage. He was chosen not for strength or rank, but for endurance. The boy could ride for days without complaint, without food, without water if needed, and he never asked questions. That was the first rule of the yam. Do not think beyond your horse. But that rule was not always easy to follow. It was in the summer of 1248, during the slow unraveling of the Mongol line of succession, that Oki's role changed. The great Khan Gadai had died a few years earlier. His widow, Tredjin, had tried to hold power temporarily, but the empire was fracturing beneath her dot. Every son of Genghis Khan wanted their peace. Armies began shifting. Murmurs of betrayal floated on the wind. It was during this time that Oki Balad was summoned not to ride between stations, but to take a sealed package from Karakorum, the imperial capital, to a tent deep in the Altai Mountains. The package was wrapped in thick felt, bound with black string, sealed not with wax, but with blood, and Oki was told only this: you must not stop at any station. Ride in silence. Avoid roads. Burn the package if anyone asks about it. If you are captured, die before you speak. He was given no guard, no companion, no additional horse, just a cold stare from a man whose robe bore the mark of the Kagan's inner court. What was in the package? Historians can only guess. Some believe it contained details of an assassination plot. Others claim it was a genealogy chart, proving that one of Genghis' sons had been adopted and thus ineligible for rule. A more poetic theory suggests it held a small lock of hair from the Khan's burial seat, relic powerful enough to start or stop a war. But Oki didn't know, and he didn't want to, because couriers who knew too much didn't last long. The journey was nearly 1,000 miles from Karakorum to a secluded pasture in the Altai range. No roads, no cities, no witnesses. He rode by night, slept by day, never using the official yam stations. He drank from puddles and ate dried meat he had stitched into his coat sleeves. Once, near the Kongai Mountains, his horse collapsed. He slit its throat to keep it from crying out and walked for 40 miles. For he found a stray mare near a riverbed. He traveled without maps, guided only by the stars and the shapes of ridges he'd memorized as a child. Twice, he passed bandits, but veered wide around them. Once, in a valley near modern-day Bogan, he saw a fire in the distant San Imperial Scout outpost. He extinguished his own lantern, circled behind the ridge, and waited until morning. Every breath, every hoofstep was calculated, because Oki Balad understood what was being asked of him. This was not a courier mission. It was a test of loyalty, or a trap, maybe both. He arrived at the hidden tent after 19 days of travel. It was smaller than expected. No guards, no heraldic banners. Just a white yurt tucked into a grove of wind-bent trees. Inside was a man Oki had never seen before. Bare-chested, hair long, rimmed with red from lack of sleep. He sat cross-legged before a low table when Oki presented the bundle. The man did not open it. He asked only one question. Did anyone see you? No. Did you open it? No. The man nodded, then gestured for Oki to leave. Not rest, not eat, not even receive a second command. Just leave. And Oki did. He rode back slower. His horse was lame. His body ached. But something else was different. He had not been dismissed from duty, but neither had he been thanked. And that was unsettling, because in the Mongol system, couriers were paid in silence. But even silence had a tone. This one felt final. When he returned to Karakorum, no one spoke to him. His quarters had been emptied. His name was absent from the duty roster. He had been erased but left alive. This was rare, because couriers who saw too much were usually disappeared quietly. Yet Oki Balad was not executed. He was simply ignored, and in the months that followed, rumors emerged. A general fell from grace. A scroll went missing from the Khan's archive. A scribe was poisoned during a feast, and the man in the Altai Mountains, never seen again. It was as if whatever Oki had delivered had triggered a silent war. But no records explained how years later, after the empire had fractured further, and the line of succession stabilized under Kublai Khan, a clerk found a scrap of parchment in the corner of an archive bin. It was unsigned, undated. It read, "There is no faster horse than silence, K, and no more loyal man than the one we've left invisible." It is believed to reference Oki Balad. Today, historians have only fragments: a birth record, a travelogue, a single ceremonial token buried in the ruins of an old yam station engraved with the image of a broken wheel and a wingless bird. Some say this symbol means a courier who will never fly again. Others interpret it differently: a secret that landed so softly no one heard it arrive. Yeah, that's where we'll pause, because the story of Oki Balad is not complete. The man who carried the empire's most dangerous message was never seen again after that final assignment, but his absence still echoes in the bureaucratic folds of Mongol history, and it leaves us wondering what was in that package that made the empire erase its own courier, and why, of all people, was he allowed to live? The Mongol Empire, at its height, was stitched together, not just by swords and sieges, but by information. Riders like Oki Balad formed the invisible seams of that empire. But once Oki delivered that silent bundle and vanished from the yam system, something strange began to unfold: quiet shifts in policy, cryptic deaths, gaps in record-keeping that grew wider year after year. This is where our story deepens, not in the dust kicked up by his horse, but in the absences left behind. We are not just tracing the life of a courier. We are tracing the path of a man deliberately erased. And to do that, we have to follow his ghost through imperial memos, through grain shipments, through a single campfire in the Orkan Valley that no one was supposed to remember. 3 winters passed after Oki Balad's final mission. By 1251, Genghis Khan, grandson of Genghis, had seized power in a maneuver some call smooth and others still call a silent coup. Documents from this transition show an unusual number of purges among the messenger class. Not generals, not treasurers, not rival KHINs, messengers, middlemen, people who didn't carry power but carried its instructions. Their names disappear from yam rosters. Delivery logs are redacted. Even food rations, slips, vanish. Why? Because someone was erasing a leak, or a whisper, or a letter that had done more damage than 1,000 arrows ever could. And always threaded between these disappearances were brief references to the Altai courier or the silent horse. One scribe, in a commentary preserved in the Mongolian Secret History, wrote simply, "We fear lest a man who leads 10,000 than the one who delivers a folded square of felt in the night." In the spring of 1252, a monk named Yelu Tashi arrived in Karakoram. He was not a court official. He was not even Mongol. He was a heathen scholar-turned-clerk, assigned to review older imperial orders for preservation. The Mongols had inherited many Chinese and heathen record-keepers, men tasked with turning oral commands into stone policy. Yelu Tashi was diligent, too diligent. Perhaps while translating yam records into Chinese script, he found anomalies. Writers listed on journeys they never completed, payments issued to couriers who had died years earlier, sealed instructions sent from departments that, on paper, no longer existed. One of these anomalies had no name, no origin city, and no return log, just a note, dispatched to the Altai range with item threefold. Another simply read, returned. Redacted. Yelu Tashi became obsessed. He began drawing maps, timelines, red string webs of who had written what, who had signed off, how had vanished soon after. At the center of it all a courier with no subsequent record, and a sealed bundle labeled in one document only as Tegis no Gun, the verdant truth. Was that the name of the object, or the name of a program? Code for a purge? A prophecy? Code, maybe just the internal nickname of a single man's message. Code. Tashi wrote in his private annotations. Some truths are not documented in ink, but in absence. I follow not the message, but its shadow. That annotation, too, was later struck through in red ink. But Yalu Tashi was not alone in his suspicions. A different kind of evidence emerges from the travelogues of one Sardaquanan inspector tasked with auditing the Yam stations in northern Mongolia. In 1254, he filed a complaint that a station near the Orkhan River had been operating unofficially, housing couriers no longer on active rosters. One entry stood out. The station chief reported a lone rider who refused food, requested no fresh horse, and paid with an old imperial token, no longer in circulation. The chief wrote, he bore no scroll. He bore no seal, but he asked only for a quiet place to rest, and then disappeared before sunrise. He moved like a man carrying the weight of something he had already delivered. That token was sent to Karakoram for verification. It was never catalogued. It vanished, much like the man who had used it. So what became of Oki Balad? There are three competing theories. Let's unfold them slowly, like a scroll set gently on the floor of a yurt. Unrolled, not for decree, but for contemplation. Theory 1. He was executed in secret. This is the most common belief among historians. The Mongols, despite their efficiency, were often ruthless about information security. It is said that imperial couriers who completed high-risk missions were sometimes lured back to the capital and then dispatched quietly poisoned at dinner, suffocated in their tents, were sent on final rides from which they never returned. But this theory raises a problem. If Oki was eliminated, why do traces of his passage continue for years afterward? Why do scribes in 1257 still refer to the Altai man? Why do off-duty station keepers in remote posts mention sightings always brief, always vague of a lone rider who never spoke but always rode due west? A man who slept on the ground. Man who arrived with an old token and left before the roosters crowed. Theory 2. He entered the secret. Some argue Oki was not killed but absorbed, drafted into the empire's underground wing. The Kari, a small group of men tasked with preserving and destroying sensitive information. This unit had no fixed base, no emblems, no records. They were shadows who managed the empire's shadows erasing documents, discrediting informants, controlling the flow of sensitive knowledge. One fragment from a confiscated scroll references a courier who saw, but never read, and thus was chosen to carry without burden. Could this describe Oki? Did his loyalty, his refusal to ask questions, elevate him to a position where he no longer needed a name? In this view, Oki did not vanish, simply ceased to exist. Publicly. Theory 3. He went into self-imposed exile. This is the most poetic theory and the most tragic. Some believe Oki Balad, knowing what he had carried, chose to remove himself from the empire rather than risk being used again. He fled into Sebik, the mountains, lived as a herder, died without children, man who served his empire so well that it left him no future. There are folk songs, rare and untranslated, in some regions of western Mongolia that tell of the man who erased his own tracks, a rider who rode alone at dusk and buried his horse's hooves in ash so they left no prints. Was this Oki, or just a metaphor for what the empire did to men like him? In all of this, there's one more curious element. In 1260, at the foothills of the Sion Mountains, a young boy digging near a ruined yam post uncovered a flat stone. It bore no writing, no name, just the carved image of a man holding a sealed scroll, riding a horse whose mouth had been sewn shut. It now sits in the Mongolian National Museum under the label Anonymous Courier. Date unknown. But some believe it is Oki Balad, a man who served not to be remembered, but to be forgotten. Exactly. And here we are, centuries later, still trying to follow his trail and failing, because perhaps that was his purpose, to carry the message and erase the path. The Mongol Empire did not build monuments to messengers. It raised no statues to scribes. It recorded few details about those who moved its messages, not because they were unimportant, but because they were invisible by design. In the world of the Khans, information was the one force more powerful than the army itself. And so, the men who moved it were kept faceless shadows across the steppe. But sometimes, a shadow lingers, long after the sun sets. And as we come to the final stretch of Oki Balad's story, we are left with the strange task of trying to honor someone the world was never meant to remember. By 1264, Kublai Khan had firmly taken the reins of the Mongol Empire and shifted the political center eastward, closer to China. The capital would eventually become Khambalik, modern-day Beijing. In the quiet shuffle of this reorganization, many older administrative records from the early Genghis period were copied, burned, or quietly lost as the empire refined its image. Among these were Yam inspection ledgers, including those from the reigns of Ogedei and Menengi. One such ledger, found in a crumbling monastery near the Khangai Mountains in 1907 by Russian ethnography Nikolai Yadrintsov, contained several damaged FOL. It was mostly mundane: food rations, saddle inventory, salt, barrel receipts. But one line stood out: transfer of memory log to the black chest. Courier refused to sign. Seal confirmed by third witness. Message read only by the Khan. That was it. No name, no message, no record of what the courier had delivered. Only this cryptic phrase: transfer of memory log. Was it a scroll? A confession? A witness statement? Or was it something far stranger, some coded knowledge not meant for public governance, but for dynastic memory? A kind of imperial inheritance, passed like a torch from ruler to ruler, kept alive only by deliberate forgetting. The phrase, black chest, also appears in other records from this period. Most often, it's associated with the Kar Tingri, or black sky spirits, invoked by shamans in state rituals. But some historians argue it referred instead to a literal boxen oaken coffer kept in the mobile garayurt of the Kagan himself, containing relics, prophecies, or documents that could append the legitimacy of certain rulers. No one knows what was in it, but some believe Oki Balad delivered its final content, and then disappeared, not as a victim, but as part of the design. Let's turn away for a moment from the couriers, their cargo. Let's talk about the Mongol relationship to death. The way they buried their dead tells us everything about the world they believed in, and the secrets they hoped to carry into it. Unlike the Egyptians or the Romans, the Mongols buried their leaders and honored warriors without names, without tombstones, without recorded coordinates. Genghis Khan himself was supposedly buried by a secret retinue that then killed all witnesses and were themselves executed. The earth was trampled by horses. Trees were replanted. The river Selenga was allegedly diverted over his grave. Whether these legends are fact or fiction, it's less important than the meaning they carried: to die with no trace, to return completely to the earth, to become invisible forever. This was not shame. This was reverence. This was transcendence. And perhaps Oki Balad, the figure he represents, was granted the same kind of unmarked parchnat as punishment, but as honored a courier so faithful to silence that silence became his grave. In a remote shrine near Tisa Serleg, an unusual oral tradition persists among a local Bujat community. They tell of a man called Zian Kar Nudoch, the eastbound black nomad. He was not a warrior, not a monk, not a prince. He was the man who did not look back. Enda. Stories. He arrives once a generation, stays in a felt tent, no larger than a horse blanket. Hand speaks only one sentence to the head elder. What is remembered must not be written. He then leaves before the full moon rises. There is no archaeological evidence linking this figure to Oki Balad. There are no scrolls, no bones, no corroboration. But the elders still light a candle each spring equinox and place beside it a black horsehair bridle, no name, no prayer, just an object waiting for someone to return and carry something away again. There are those who argue that Oki Balad is not exceptional, that hundreds of couriers vanished into the folds of empire, and there, right? But what makes his story worth telling is not his uniqueness, it is his ordinariness, because in the great sweep of Mongol expansion across Asia, the Middle East, even Europe, what mattered most were not the conquests, but the cords that held them together. The policies, the supplies, the translated scrolls, the whispered orders between distant commanders. The couriers were the arteries, and when one such artery disappeared, it meant something deeper was bleeding beneath the surface. One final piece of this story comes from a curious letter written in the late 1270s by an Nestorian Christian merchant named Bar Sama. Originally from the Yuan court, he traveled westward, eventually reaching the Abbasid Caliphate and then parts of Europe. In a letter to a monk in Moraga, he described passing a desolate station near the Altai foothills, where an elderly man maintained a single, unused stable. When asked why he stayed, the man replied, "I wait for the rider who took the green bundle." Bar Sama pressed him, asking when this rider was supposed to return. The man only smiled. He returns when the empire forgets him. It's unclear if this was metaphor, madness, or memory, but it's the last known reference to Oki Balador, whoever carried that unnamed, unreadable scroll. And now, you lie here listening, hundreds of years later, perhaps a little drowsy, perhaps not, but there's something oddly comforting about a man who served, vanished, and let the silence hold him. Not all history is in gold or blood. Sometimes it's in the space between names. Sometimes it's in the dust, not disturbed. Sometimes it's a scroll delivered by a man with no face to a Khan who never shared its words. And maybe, just maybe, history is shaped less by what is said than what is never spoken at all, at all. In the land where the wind never settles and the sky folds over like a giant gray hide, there exists a valley untouched by monuments. No headstones, no funeral mounds, no markers etched to stone or bone. The goats avoid it. The shepherds cross themselves as they pass, and the elders call it the valley without graves. It stretches along the edge of the Anan River, where the foothills of the Kinti Range lean westward and the grass grows unusually tall. There is no temple here, no shrine, but according to oral legend and to a few obscure pages in the secret history of the Mongols, this was once a sacred place, but not for the living. It was a city for the dead, not in the way we imagine a cemetery with names, stories, and orderly rows, but a silent field where the Mongol elite were laid to rest in a way that left nothing behind. Or so they thought. You see, Mongol burial customs were not like the European rituals of the same period. There were no churches with tolling bells, no processions of black-veiled mourners walking behind a casket. The Mongols followed a code rooted in anonymity, in dissolution. In returning the body to the earth without spectacle, to die was not to be remembered. It was to disappear. This concept is known in some oral traditions as Kartsag Tinger, the severed sky. It implies that when a soul leaves the body, it joins the wind without echo. It's no longer needing a name. And so, the most honored leaders, especially during the early days of Genghis Khan's rise, were interred with a chilling consistency, buried without a single trace left above ground. This was neglect. It was intention. Historical Chinese sources from the Yuan dynasty mention a class of imperial servants called Nakar, Kartha, black companions. These were men assigned not to protect the living Khan, but to bury him in death and then disappear. Their fates are never recorded. Some say they were killed after the burial to preserve the secrecy of the location. Others believe they took vows of silence and lived as wandering monks or disappeared into the steppes as hermits. But it wasn't just the leaders who were buried this way. It extended, in certain circles, to favored generals, court astrologers, even the imperial concubines who bore royal bloodlines. The Mongol idea of honor did not revolve around leaving behind a name. It centered on leaving behind no burden, not for the living, not for the land. The valley without graves first appears in surviving written records in a set of Persian scrolls known as the Jami Tolarikta, Compendium of Chronicles by Rashid al-Din. In one volume, a brief note appears under an entry for a Mongol general named Borku. He was sent east and never returned. It is said he rests among the grass that hides the bones of princes. No location is given, no map accompanies the text, but a companion folio held in a Tibetan monastery mentions a green river near the White Forest where riders walk beside their horses, not atop them. This phrase, riders walking beside their horses, was an old Mongol euphemism for death. It was said that when you died, your horse kept walking, but you could no longer ride. Your shadow followed, but your name did not. Local herders near the area have long told stories of nighttime sounds, clinking stirrups, hooves without horses, laughter with no mouths. They call it Ezian, Kadni, to do the sound of the Lord's rock. Many believe the valley is haunted, not by ghosts in the European sense, but by the presence of people who were never meant to be found. Invisible warriors, dead riders, women buried beside chiefs, servants who carried secrets into the soil. The quiet grass covers it all, moving with the wind, revealing nothing. No archaeologist has ever officially confirmed that this region contains elite Mongol burials. The ground offers no clues, no pottery fragments, no carved stones, no relics, but the absence itself has become a kind of presence, a mute history pressed flat into the earth. In the late 1960s, Soviet geographers mapping parts of northern Mongolia for military routes took aerial photographs of the Ain Basin. They noticed an odd patch of land, perfectly oval, ringed by birch trees, with no signs of livestock intrusion or human settlement. The trees grew denser on the outside of the ring. The interior was untouched. One scientist called it a wound. The forest refuses to heal. No official excavation was allowed, partly due to political restrictions, partly out of respect for local taboos. But in the 1990s, a Mongolian-Ukrainian research team took limited soil samples along the perimeter. They found unusually compacted earth, consistent with human activity, but no artifacts. One geologist noted that the mineral composition of the soil showed spikes in iron and calcium, potentially indicating a high concentration of decomposed organic material consistent with human remains. Still, no bones were found, no tools, no inscriptions, just dense, silent soil. The Mongols had another burial method, not often discussed: the use of deep stone shafts, sometimes as much as 20 meters underground, dug not into mountains or cliffs, but into flat land, then sealed with layers of turf. Over time, the top layer would regrow, leaving no sign a grave was ever there. This method was likely reserved for the highest elite, especially those connected directly to the bloodline of Genghis Khan. But the problem is, no confirmed royal grave from the golden lineage has ever been found. Not Genghis, not Ogayad, not Tolui, not Mangai, and not even Kublai, whose rule touched China and transformed the empire itself. The greatest imperial dynasty in world history vanished into dirt with no trail. Why? Some say it was practically avoiding grave robbers or desecration. Others say it was spiritual or final, its act of humility. But the most compelling answer may be cultural. To be buried without legacy was, paradoxically, the greatest proof that your legacy was secure. It did not need remembering. It had already been lived. There is one last piece of this story. A faded leather fragment found in 2012 by a Kazakh herder near the Kurlan River. It bore a stitched symbol, a falcon with no eyes. Mongol falconry symbols are common in traditional embroidery, but falcons are almost always drawn with sharp, detailed eyes. This one was blind. Above the falcon was a word in early Mongol script, Nurgi. It means no name. Scholars debated its meaning. Was it the name of a person, a rank, cipher, or perhaps the emblem of an entire class of people, those who chose not to leave their identity behind? The blind falcon, the unnamed rider, the grave with no stone, all pointing toward a worldview that still challenges our idea of history itself. And now, you lie here, perhaps tucked in, the world around you quiet, maybe not unlike the valley without graves. The Mongols saw death not as a tragedy, but as a quiet transition into formlessness. Their greatest leaders vanished like mist, and their most sacred dead asked for no recognition, no reminder, only rest, only silence, only the memory that never speaks. So tonight, as you drift into sleep, ask yourself, what if the greatest legacy you could leave was the one no one could ever trace? You can imagine it now, can't you? A man alone on the steppe, wearing no armor, carrying no flag. The sun is low. His horse is quiet beneath him, but strapped across the horse's side, tucked inside a rolled hide, is something that cannot be seen only. Buried. It's not treasure in the way you'd expect. It's not gold. It's not silver. It's not even the bones of a king. It's duty. The kind of duty that doesn't ask questions. The kind of duty that erases the person who carries it. The Mongol Empire relied not just on its cavalry, but on a web of silent logistical power men, whose names were never recorded, whose work began only after the conquests were done. These were the silent barriers, not priests, not warriors, not artisans, but men entrusted with the disposal of power. They were selected with extreme caravan, drawn from distant tribes, loyal not to blood, but to bond. Many were orphans raised inside the imperial court, but outside the imperial name. They owed their entire existence to the empire, and when the empire whispered, they obeyed. When a great Mongol died, especially one of royal blood, a small group was dispatched, often under the cover of darkness. Their instructions were unspoken. They didn't need to be told. They were the last to see the body, and the last to leave a trace of themselves behind. The process was precise. The location was not predetermined by maps, hub'd by omens, visions in the clouds, bird patterns, or the behavior of horses. Mongol shamans or Bao would guide the selection through ritual. If a bird flew over twice without stopping, the site was rejected. If a fox crossed the clearing, the burial could proceed. These signs were read with absolute seriousness. They were not symbolic. They were binding. Once chosen, the burial began. But it was not a simple act of digging. First, the topsoil was carefully removed and set aside. The grass, the roots, the stones, all cataloged in memory. The hole itself might be as deep as a 2-story house, wide enough for a horse to be lowered alongside its master. The Mongols believed in carrying the necessities of travel into death. A warrior would be buried with his saddle, his bow, perhaps, a strip of dried meat tucked in a leather pouch, a knife, and a single ring of iron. Not cold iron. Durable, common, forgotten by thieves. Then the body was placed in silence. No prayers, no songs, only the rhythm of dirt returning to where it came from. And when the pit was filled, the topsoil was replaced precisely as it had been removed. The grass laid flat, the stones positioned as before, the scene reversed as if the land had never been disturbed. But here's the most unsettling part. According to accounts in later Persian chronicles, particularly Tariq, Jahanjassatha barriers were often killed immediately after completing their task, not out of cruelty, out of necessity, not by strangers, but by each other. Some would draw lots, others would take poison prepared before the ceremony. There are even whispered records of burial squads burying themselves alive after completing their final rites. These details are hard to confirm, and some historians dispute them as myth layered on myth. But Mongol culture had no fear of such finality. To be forgotten was not dishonored, it was purity. If death was the door, anonymity was the lock. Over time, entire forests may have grown over these grave sites. Lakes may have been fed by rains that touched the helmets of forgotten men. And yet, despite all this invisibility, something remains. Not bones, not gold, but patterns, strange ones. Satellite imagery from the past 2 decades has revealed peculiar formations across parts of Mongolia's Khinty and Kongai regions. Perfect circles of discoloration in grassy plains, shallow depressions in clusters of 3s and 5s. Some suspect these are ancient burial sites, others say they are natural phenomena, permafrost shifts, or animal activity. But then there's the outlier. A 2017 analysis by an international team of archaeologists found magnetic anomalies in a region east of the Annan River. These anomalies suggest large underground cavities, possibly man-made, containing traces of horse remains and metallic objects, but too deep to excavate without extensive disruption. Out of respect, and in the absence of clear evidence, no digging has been done. The graves remain untouched, the last riders still resting. The Mongol burial code, if we can even call it that, was never written down. There is no scroll, no legal edict, only practices, whispered, repeated, obeyed. But some oral traditions carry faint echoes of it in the Altan Topchi, a 17th century chronicle compiled in Mongolia. There is a quiet, easily missed passage. The bones of the Khan do not rise. The horse does not whinny. The wind crosses the steppe as if no one ever breathed here. It's not a command, it's an observation, a philosophy, an understanding that legacy doesn't always come from what is seen. Sometimes the truest legacy is what can never be traced. You might wonder why they did it this way. Why choose disappearance over permanence? Why erase the lives of such towering figures, conquerors, builders, rulers? The answer may lie in their worldview. To the Mongols, the empire was never about stone walls or cities or libraries. It was about movement, about change, about freedom from the burdens of the past. A grave is a burden. It ties a man to a place. It invites pilgrimage. Worship. Politics. Graves become altars. Altars become excuses. But if there is no grave, then there is only the life lived, nothing more. No politics, no legacy disputes, no shrine to fight over. Just memory, or nothing at all. In the early 13th century, a man named Yelu Chukaviv, Khitan origin, served as an advisor to Genghis Khan. He famously tried to convince the Mongols to spare cities and collect taxes instead of slaughtering everyone. He also kept records, many of which were later lost or suppressed, but in a preserved letter found in fragments in northern China. Yelu wrote, "The Khan asked me, should I have a stone over my body when I die? I told him, even mountains are ground to dust in time. Let the wind be your stone." He smiled and said, "Then I shall ride into the wind and leave no dust at all." We don't know if this exchange truly happened, But even if it didn't, the idea holds. The Mongols didn't want to be remembered with permanence. They wanted to be remembered with awe, and awe doesn't need a tomb. Imagine again that silent field. No names, no ghosts, just a sky so wide it forgets you. And perhaps you listen to the wind just right. You'll hear a hoofbeat not of someone approaching, but of someone already gone. So the question lingers. What kind of people choose to bury their dead so that even their absence cannot be proved? What did they know about memory that we've since forgotten? It's forgotten. There's a place where rivers braid like the threads of an unraveling garment. A region not far from the Ainen River, where the grasses ripple like silk in the wind and birds rarely nest. Locals do not build here. Shepherds move their flocks around its edges. Even in modern times, it has an air of being watched not by the living, but by the unseen. This area, quiet, vast, and oddly untouched, is one of several sites that Mongol oral tradition vaguely identifies as burial lands of the elite, not just warriors, but Khans, and maybe Genghis Khan himself. But this is not a place of monuments. No cairns mark the boundaries. No stone slabs announce who rests here. If anything was ever built above the ground, has long since returned to the earth. That's the point. The Mongols had a word kik, tengri meaning blue sky, but also symbolizing the eternal, heaven, the unknowable, the formless. To be buried beneath kik tengri was not to be hidden from sight, but to return to the great silence that gives all life its shape, where other empires built pyramids or cathedrals to scrape the sky. The Mongols buried their leaders beneath it and marked, so the sky would remain theirs alone. You must imagine this, not as neglect, but as reverence through invisibility to mark. The grave was to insult the sky. To leave a tomb was to claim permanence in a world defined by impermanence, and to be remembered by name was to interrupt the journey of the soul, which the Mongols believed should pass freely into the wind, into the grass, into the gallop of another rider, far beyond the steppe. Much of what we know about these practices comes indirectly through outsiders. Chinese chronicles from the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol-led rule over China hint at strange, unspoken rituals. Persian historians like Rashid al-Din offer scattered insights, though often through layers of interpretation. Russian monks recorded encounters with Mongol detachments that seemed to vanish overnight, leaving behind no signs of their presence, not even footprints. But there's one account that lingers. In 1254, the Franciscan monk William of Rubrac traveled to the Mongol Empire as an emissary of King Louis IX of France. His mission was political, to seek alliance, or at least gather intelligence. But Rubrac, a curious and careful observer, took notes not just on the grandeur of courts, but on the quiet details of everyday Mongol life. In one passage, he describes a man being led away at night without rope or weapon. The man, he was told, had once served at the court of Genghis Khan and now was being taken to complete a circle. Rubrac didn't understand what this meant. Neither do we. But many believe it referred to the burial ritual, this idea that those who served a ruler in life would serve him one final time in death by disappearing alongside him. This concept, service beyond death, is not unique to the Mongols. Ancient Chinese emperors were buried with terracotta armies. Egyptian pharaohs entombed their attendants. Viking kings sometimes took their slaves with them into burial ships set aflame. But the Mongols did something different. They didn't just bury people, they buried memory. They erased the trail, and in doing so, they preserved a legacy not of place, but of presence in the air, in the silence, in the way the wind touches your cheek on a cold steppe morning and makes you feel watched. Though no one is near, by the 14th century, as Mongol power began to fracture and recede, the old burial rites faded from prominence. Successor khanates, like the Golden Horde and the Ilkhanate adopted new customs, mixing Islamic, Christian, and local practices into their rituals. Cities grew, tombs returned, names were carved once more into stone. But in the Mongol heartland in Mongolia proper, the older customs lingered longer, protected by remoteness, tradition, and a cultural memory that refused to fossilize. Even today, some Mongol families still honor their dead with quiet burials, far from any road or map, using only the wind and the stars to guide the grave. No GPS, no marker, just a circle of absence in the earth, and a promise not to return. What might be the psychological effect of such a culture? A child growing up among the Mongols would not learn the names of the dead. He would not visit the tomb of his great-grandfather. He would not leave flowers on a grave or kneel in front of an epitaph. Instead, he would hear stories, would be told without ending, without a place to point to, without a photograph or a shrine. Death was not location-bound. It was absorbed, assimilated into the wind, into the hoofbeat, into the hush of twilight. This kind of grief is not loud. It does not cry in stone. It listens, and in that listening, perhaps, there is a kind of peace that permanence can never offer. In recent decades, international teams have tried to locate the grave of Genghis Khan. They've used drones, LiDAR scans, ground-penetrating radar. They've trekked for miles, interviewed locals, deciphered clues from ancient manuscripts. Some believe he was buried at the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldun. Others insist it was farther east, Nikinti wilderness. But I'll agree on one thing. There is no sign, no inscription, no mausoleum, and perhaps that is the most fitting monument of all, because in the silence of his grave, Khan remains as elusive as his empire was vast. To find his body would be too disturbed. A mystery that was never meant to be solved. It would be like trying to capture wind in your hands. It slips through, not because it resists, but because it was never meant to stay. So we are left with this: a people who erased their own tracks, a culture that chose anonymity over honor, a ruler who ruled the world and then vanished without a trace. Not because he lacked power, but because the greatest power is to let go completely, to leave the world as if you were never here, so that only your absence remains. You may be wondering why. We've told you this, why we've spent nearly 2 hours recounting graves that don't exist, names that were never recorded, and stories that can't be proven. Perhaps it's because, in a world obsessed with being remembered, the Mongols remind us of something quieter, something older, that to live fully does not require leaving a trail, that some legacies don't shout, they whisper, and that sometimes the greatest stories are not the ones carved into stone, but the ones carried by the wind from one rider to the next. Asterisk, good night. ...